Good evenings, people, and welcome to Slender Fortress. And in this video, I'm making my own class balancing wishlist for Slender Fortress. For those who don't know, the classes in Slender Fortress, outside Globables that is currently, have their own unique stat, and nearly all Slender servers use the modified one. And with the introduction for class stat modification nearly a half a year ago, you as a server owner can rebalance any class that fit for the balance or playstyle. But in this video isn't about them balancing or me wishing for server admins to do what I like. It's usually just my own rebalance ideas I'm making for Slender Fortress classes. If I own a server, that is. Before I go into my own balancing for each classes, I do need to clarify certain things I want to mention. Now, I'm not 100% the best when it comes to balancing and such, but for these balances, I'm making every class both practically useful and enjoyable to play. And this is only for the best and basic stock loadout, and non-causing campers, escape plans or amputator do not count as they're not stock weapons. Also, this comes from experiencing the game for nearly 10 years of playing the game mode, so I'm making my own changes, buffs and nerfs for certain classes. Also, there's gonna be a lot of borrowing from pre-classless globe server to certain classes because I like the classes the most in this era of Slender. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Starting out with the first class, we have the Skunk, aka the Scout. Now, Scout is arguably one of two best classes in Slender Fortress currently, and that's mainly due to being one of the two sprint classes in the game. Now, he's got 50% faster movement speed and a 5% more louder footsteps. Now, I don't have issue with the Scout being the fastest class in the game, as he's pretty frail like the other four classes. However, my issue though, it's the louder footsteps. While sure, it's made to nerf Scout against silent or survival bosses and give it in a downside. This isn't the case when it comes to groups, however, and having Scout trigger the footstep will also trigger the boss aggro until the boss auto chases the person who triggered the last, which makes the Scout unintentionally a team killing class, which isn't a good thing. If there was any list of most hated class in Slender Fortress, it would probably be the Scout. And while you might think that you can just stand still and wait until boss chases the Scout, there's a situation where you are on the other side of the room and have no clue if there is a nearby Scout. And couple that with the fastest movement speed in the game, and Scout becomes the one class that gets you killed the most. Now, 5% isn't nearly as bad as Gloop's before classes, but still, having an ability that triggers blind bosses to your entire team is a bad game design. For this reason, I would rather remove the downside and replace it with damage vulnerability instead. Maybe 20% to have like max of 100 HP. Now, this does make Scout much frailer, or the frailest class in the game, but this only becomes a problem if you're using Scout for tanking, which he isn't supposed to be good at, and he's more designed for running. Now, there are weapons that could hinder Scout's stats like Sun on a Stick, but that really doesn't change much since Scouts mainly have low damage. And for a class with the lowest health in the game, that isn't gonna change much anyways. Now, could have a new upside, maybe a slightly faster sprint recharge, but other than that, it's basically a rework. Now, this Scout, my version of Scout would become much more specialized at running, and his downside being frail and doing less melee damage means that he's more used for running than tanking. He isn't good against range or proxy bosses, but it doesn't really change much from Scott previously. He's almost the same except a little bit nerfed. It's not exactly the biggest nerf of Scout, because you can still play it. And I would say my version of Scott is a running specialist. And that's about it. Now, up to the next one, which is the military man himself, the soldier. Soldier is up next, and what current soldier is, to be bluntly, boring. His only stat is that he doesn't lose jump if not sprinting, and that's about it really. Now, this isn't nearly as bad as older version of soldier, other than soldier being the most jack of all trade class in the game, but he's just really class without anything that makes him stand out from other classes. And besides, there is a real jack of all trade class in the game, but I'll get to that later. Now, what would I change for soldier for making him stand out from other classes? Well, soldier used to have a unique stat that make him really good, and that was in global server before classless. And for those who don't know, soldier used to have a stat that made him static resistant. Now, currently on other server, static is affected by health, and the only class with static resistance is the heavy, which doesn't really work due to slow speed. Now, why would I give soldier higher static resistance then? Well, that's because static bosses are surprisingly dangerous, especially in higher difficulty, and soldier would work well and stand out. He doesn't have good speed, but he has weapons like escape plan or disciplinary action for good speed. Now, he wouldn't exactly be the best class in the game, but he's much more of a step up previously. I could also give him a recovery time for static, but I'm not sure if I want to include the jump thing. It's kinda minor, unnecessary, and I think jumping should weigh sprint. It's not that he has anything special, but it doesn't make soldier overpowered or underpowered. It just makes him a specialist class that handles any static bosses, which is a nice thing. My own version of soldier would be like a specialist class that handles static pretty well. He has some good weapons, but regular soldier is gonna be much more fun than previous boring soldier. Now, let's move on to the pyromaniac itself, the Pyro. Now, Pyro is next, and he has arguably the most underrated stat, and that's Afterbirth immunity. Afterbirth is one of the deadliest effects in Slender Fortress, and that's mainly the lack of healing and the fact that it's damage over time, which Pyro shines by. While Pyro by himself doesn't seem that bad at first, then you have to consider the existence of one weapon, the Darwin's Danger Shield, and oh boy does it give Pyro run for this money. Darwin's Danger Shield didn't used to have this stat, but after Jungle Inferno, it basically does Pyro's job better. plus giving Sniper 50% extra resistance against fire, which means that Sniper has around 250 health compared to Pyro against fire, which I find it kind of problematic. And I don't know about the modified version, but Pyro gets a little bit of damage resistance, making him almost as tanky as Soldier or Demo with booties. But that doesn't pretty much say much. Now, I could nerf the Darwin's Danger Shield if I owned the server, but I also think about buffing Pyro a little bit. I could give Pyro 50% more fire resistant to make him as tanky as heavy against fire. And like what Darwin has, but there's also a little bit of an extra stat I'd add to Pyro, is that if he takes any form of fire damage, he gets a speed boost for 5 seconds. Now, at first you might think it's overpowered, because if he takes fire damage from any fire boss, then he could outrun any class and basically do whatever it wants. But here's the thing, it only requires Pyro to take from fire bosses, which are pretty rare, and it could be too overpowered, but I could say not by much. And besides, Pyro is still both vulnerable to melee, so that's a thing. But anyways, now this Pyro would be much like Soldier, very special oriented class, especially against fire. However, the fact that he gets a speed boost makes him much more versatile and effective against fire bosses. You could do anything with speed boost, like running away with power jack or get close with the back scratcher, and you could do it for either aggressive or escaping with it. Now, this could be a little bit overpowered. I could even tweak it to have 3 seconds instead of 5. But overall, it does make Pyro a very powerful class against fire bosses. And that's what I'm trying to do. Make him a very good fire immune specialist in this game mode. And nothing much of too much change, just a pretty big buff to compensate for Darwin's Danger Shield. And that's about it really. Now then, let's move on to the drunken man himself, the Demo Man. Demo Man is next, and he is one of 2 running classes in the game. He's also the real jack of all trade class, and I'll tell you the reason. Now, he is considered a sprint class due to persistency. He has more scare sprinting. However, unlike the scout, he isn't fast enough. He's more persistent. However, there are fast bosses that can easily catch him if you're not careful. So his second issue is that he is pretty bulky, especially with the bootleggers. And the fact that he has a sword means that he has much more range, and he can also decently stun bosses, unlike the scout, making him pretty good tank as well, and speed for that. However, he isn't that overwhelming to say the least, and he still gets outclassed by scout and the medic, which attack later. Now, Demo Man is one of the classes I give the slightest change, and the biggest change would be utility for scare sprint. And my biggest buff would be to give it 100 instead of 66, and a 10% extra sprint speed while scarce sprinting, or I mean extra speed. However, he also gets a little bit of a downside, 50% sprint recovery, which means that he recovers much slower than a scout or any other class. But if you're wise enough, you could actually save your sprint. However, in early game, if you want to like speed run or something, it can be a pretty negative downside. However, if you're wise enough and get chased by bosses, it doesn't become a problem. Now, it's not much of a change from previously, other than Demo being much more persistent than one previously, and slightly faster than he was before. But the new one is much more scarce sprint specialized compared to the scout, and that's all I can say really about Demo. So let's go to the next class, which is the Macho Man Fatty himself, the Heavy. Heavy Weapons is next, and Heavy Weapons is one of two survivalist classes in the game, the other being Medic. And for those who don't know what survivalist in this game mode is, it's a class that can tank hits and stun, and Heavy can tank due to high health. Now, Heavy on his own can last much longer compared to most classes. The real problem though is regen in this game, and much like I said with the Pyro, the lack of healing in this game is devastating. It doesn't also help that he's also the slowest class in the game, and he's almost out-persisted by most bosses if you don't stun the boss. Now, I know he has static resistance, like I said with the soldier, but not by much, and he's immune to bear traps, which I think is pretty unnecessary. I mean, the bear traps don't do much, you could just jump. I mean, he doesn't take any bleed damage, but that doesn't really matter, and this small thing kinda makes it pointless to say the least. Now, like I said, he has the highest health of any class, but even then he dies pretty fast. Now, there are certain bosses that Heavy is good against, and Heavy is still a pretty bulky class. Some occasions he's even better than the Medic, like he's never get one-shot by hard hitting bosses or being prioritized, which is very common on insane difficulty. However, if a Medic is pretty competent, Medic is basically better than a Heavy on most situations, unless you wanna take the challenge without using regen. So, what should I fix for the Heavy? Well, my simple answer is replace static resistant and immune bear traps with damage resistance up to 30%. Now, this is much like in group server, except there's no steam supply. Oh, I'll get to that later. Now, he is much tankier than the previous Heavy. Having 30% and 300 health means he has like 462 health, which makes him 3 times tankier than the Medic instead of 2 times. And the only reason why I would change that is so he could compensate with the regen Medic has. And he's much better against bosses directly due to sheer bulk. But even then, Medic can just heal himself, and Heavy doesn't heal himself at all, which is pretty bad, but he's much better at tanking against bosses. Now, he is still pretty slow, but if you can utilize your tankiness and you can stun bosses constantly, he becomes pretty good, I could say. Overall, he becomes much tankier than he was previously. Well then, on to the next one, which is Bob the Builder himself, the Engineer. And here we have the Engineer, and he is considered to be the worst class in Slender Fortress currently, because of his map-specific thing. While Engineer has the longest flashlight duration and can do more flashlight damage towards flashlight stun bosses, one is map-specific and there are maps with infinite flashlight, making one stat useless. And even if it did have use, it doesn't have enough, like 33% is not long enough. Meanwhile, you have this stun thing, and I'll be honest, flashlight stun bosses are way easier than melee bosses. And currently when I'm playing, there's like way too many bosses that are easy to flashlight stun. Now, Engineer is quite honestly the trickiest class I could balance around, and he does need a lot of buffs. Well, for starters, I would remove any maps with infinite flashlight entirely to make it much more of a challenge. Secondly, I want to basically boost the duration to 100 instead of 33, which is twice longer than most classes. And finally, I'd give it 30% flashlight recovery, which is pretty quick. I mean, yeah, sure, you could play the game without the flashlight, but Engineer is the only safe bet if you're playing on darker maps. Now, this change would make the Engineer the most map-specific class in the game, but I wouldn't say he would be nearly as bad as he was previously, but slightly better than he was now, or maybe even greatly buffed when every infinite flashlight maps have removed it, the infinite one. And while he isn't good against bosses, he's still better at navigation compared to most other classes. And that's really about it how I'd buff the Engineer. Now, let's move to the Doctor itself, the Medic. Next up is the Medic, and he's the second survivalist class behind the Heavy. And of all the stats of any classes have, Medic has the most broken ability, which is regen, and it heals over time. Self-explanatory. And the reason why it's so broken is because of lack of healing. Now, if you're good enough with the Medic, you could just regen yourself and heal over time, survive most boss encounter without any insta-kills or something. Although Medic does have a downside of being prioritized compared to other classes, which is sometimes really annoying to play him. But especially when there's a skunk leading a boss towards you. But if you can avoid the danger, he becomes less of an issue. It's just that even though regen is very broken, especially with the amputator, I still think Medic needs like a new downside rather than chase priority. Now, one thing I could really give is maybe nerf to regen a little bit, and another thing is, I could even give him like a second downside. A vulnerability to static comes to my mind because I still want to keep medic as a survivalist class, but I would rather give him more like another type of weakness. Static vulnerability is good because if a fruit doesn't affect at lower difficulty, at higher difficulty it can be deadly. But much like the scout, it doesn't change much. And other than giving him more like nerfs of all the classes, I basically buff most classes, but medics is the only one who I give a nerf. And I still want to keep him as a survivalist class. I still think he's fine. And he isn't much of a different than he was before, but I still think he's static vulnerability and chase priority what separates medic from being too overpowered, and currently he's fine as it is. Now let's get to the camper himself, the sniper. Sniper is probably my most divisive class. On one hand, he has really good weapon that make him strong, but on the other hand, stock sniper without causing camper or any weapon, he is kinda weak, mechanically wise. His mechanic is that he can blink the least of any class in the game, which is only handy against statue bosses. However, you could easily handle statue bosses by being groups, making the mechanic kinda worthless. And even if he does much like engineer, having 33% longer, it's still not long enough. Now, in certain server he has higher radius when it's dark, but even then, I think I want sniper to have better mechanics. Now, my trick with the sniper would be that he has, much like engineer, 100% blink instead of 33. And here's another idea that I remembered, a new second mechanic in which sniper has like 30% screen recovery. Now, what is screen recovery? Well, it's basically when there's a boss that has like a jump scare or blocks your view, this mechanic makes so that when sniper has it, it recovers much faster compared to most classes. And for class that's supposed to look, I think it could work well with sniper. And now with this nut, sniper becomes less blocked by screens, and he can also solo blink bosses. Now, he doesn't need any other mechanic because he already has like a really good weapon slots. But I would say he would become the greatest class. He's definitely not jack of all trade class, much like soldier, but he has regen, so that's about it. And much like any other much like medic or demo, he doesn't change much, which I only give like screen recovery because it's actually becomes much handier. Now then, let's move on to our final class in this list, the tuxedo terrorist himself, the spy. Finally, we got the spy. And spy specialist class, much like pyro, NG or sniper, he's basically the stealth class, since he makes much more quieter footsteps, which is useful against blind bosses and maybe survival bosses, which are one of the most dangerous types of bosses. However, my biggest problem with the spy is that he's quite the opposite to sniper. He has pretty good mechanic, but he doesn't have any good weapons. Say maybe the spy sickle, maybe kunai, but Kunai also lowers his health to half, which isn't great. And for some reason the modified community decided to give him like a chase priority, which he doesn't really need. Because in group server, Spy used to have it because he had the most overpowered supply in the game, but in modified, he doesn't really need that. I mean, he is good, but he doesn't heal or have anything. Even in proxy survival, he still dies. And my second problem is that he's probably the class that I want to also add, because sneaking is a really fun mechanic. Sure, it makes you detect less, but you move pretty slow, and I want to move fast. And it's sometimes pretty difficult to hide when boss wanders around, and it can happen in corners and such. Now, for this one, I just remove Spy's priority completely, and I instead decided to give him a buff, like buff of moving 25% faster while crouching. I got this idea from Minecraft, from Sniffed Sneak enchantment, which basically does the same thing. And his faster sneak speed means that he can hide on corners much faster. Now, it pretty much would work, especially in this game, and I'm not sure if it contradicts with his silent footsteps, but much like any other class, it's not changed too much. And overall, I could say that the Spy in this one is basically much faster at sneaking than he was previously. And it becomes slightly better at handling blind bosses, especially when you're trying to hide, but overall it doesn't change much. And anyways, this is the last class I'd be talking about. Alright, back to the spawn. Thanks for watching. Now, this was my class balance idea making. Now, like I said previously, I'm not 100% at balancing, and these are just my own ideas. However, I could do it at one point if I decided to own a Slender server. And these are just my own experience when playing Slender for like 7, 8, 9 years. And these are one of those idea videos I'm making, and I could add more of it in the future, like boss changes I could make, gameplay changes and such. Some can be controversial, others not. And there's like few things like team supplies I could add, and all the other cool stuff. Now then, comment down below if you like my ideas or not, and I'll get you guys later when I'll make another Slender video in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for my next video. See you later.